Well, now let's take a look at number 60, Super Typhoon Peggy, which passed initially through the Mariana Islands as a developing tropical storm, and then went into the Philippine Sea, where it peaked as a Category 5 storm. And I think we all know what's going to happen next. Yes, it's another landfall on the Philippine island of Luzon, this time as a Cat 3. And then Peggy advanced forward and eventually made landfall in China as well as a tropical storm just east of Hong Kong. Peggy, again very strong, 160 miles an hour its peak wind speed, and its lowest air pressure bottomed out at 900 millibars. So a very intense storm as well there, nearly sub 900. Two landfalls, the strongest one being 115 miles an hour. Only $3 million of damages, so not much, but 422 fatalities bumps up its rank on Hurricane Week 2015, and over 6,600 buildings damaged as well. We expect it significantly more than that figure. Here's the satellite imagery of the storm as it passed through the Philippines and beyond. Well then, number 59, the Cuba-Brownsville hurricane, one of many strong storms that formed in the hectic 1933 Atlantic hurricane season. It was Hurricane 8, which started life as a rather weak system in the central part of the Atlantic, then developed into a tropical storm on approach to the Leeward Islands, passing those islands as a Category 1 hurricane and gradually intensifying all the way beyond Puerto Rico as a Cat 3, and then passing through the Bahamas as a remarkable Category 5 storm, its first peak there. Then it moved, just grazed the north coast of Cuba as a Category 3, and then re-strengthened into a secondary peak there as a Category 4 storm. Intensity it maintained almost as far as Brownsville. It did reach Brownsville as a Cat 3. This storm, as you saw, peaked as a 160 mile an hour Category 5 storm. Its lowest air pressure was reported to be 930 millibars. Two landfalls in the end, the strongest one with winds of 125 miles an hour. That one's the Brownsville landfall, I presume. $28 million of damages. Adjusted for inflation, that's a whopping $508 million. 179 fatalities as well, a significant storm that dumped over 15 inches of rain.
Typhoon Megi of 2010, or in the Philippines Typhoon Wanda, will go down as the deepest landfall anywhere in the world on record at 885 millibars in the northern Philippines. This storm ended up crossing over Luzon after rapidly intensifying from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in underneath 24 hours, where it kept its Category 5 strength and maximum intensity pretty much all the way until its landfall on Luzon.
Remarkable how it managed to keep that intensity and still survive on the other side of the Philippines as well for another landfall. Its peak wind speed 185 miles an hour, as we heard, 885 millibars. Two landfalls, peak intensity at landfall, $6 million of damages and over 600 fatalities. Though despite its massive landfall, I think some would argue that it was probably a worse storm for China rather than the Philippines. It's also the centre of Hurricane Week 2015's big logo.
Since Luzon is rather sparsely populated, and what population is there, there's not much worth to it, the death toll and damages were rather low for the storm of this intensity.
But make no mistake, near the epicenter of the storm's first landfall in the Philippines, it really was an area of total destruction, as you can see on some of those images in the top right of your screen. Now it's for Hurricane Hattie, which formed in 1961 in the Atlantic, a Cat 5 that some people may well forget, or a similar track to Mitch actually, until the final part where it made landfall in Belize as a strong Category 4. Very strong landfall there. Could have been worse, of course. As a Cat 5, it peaked just before that landfall with winds of 160 miles an hour and a pressure of 920 millibars in the end. Just the one landfall, it was 140 miles an hour, so it was weakening rather quickly it seems. $60 million of damages at the time. Today that translates to $477 million, and it killed over 300 people in the end and damaged over 6,000 buildings.
Hurricane Dean will always be regarded as one of the most intense landfalling storms on record in the Atlantic Basin at 905 millibars, which it made landfall across the Yucatan Peninsula. The storm ended up rapidly intensifying actually before landfall to reach this strength.
Indeed, Dean's peak intensity was 175 miles an hour with an air pressure of 905 millibars until that landfall. Very strong indeed. Certainly one of the strongest in recent times to make landfall at that intensity. 2 landfalls, $1.7 billion of damages in the end. Today that's 1.9, 45 fatalities and over 3,000 buildings damaged, with lots of images coming up.
Hurricane Dean was also at 175 miles per hour at an earlier point in the eastern Caribbean, and then it started interacting with the Greater Antilles, and a very close passage to Jamaica really started to slow down the system. After it passed over the Yucatan Peninsula, it would reemerge into the Bay of Campeche and reorganize itself slightly before making a second landfall in Mexico. Although the death toll was rather small for a Category 5 landfall, the damage was over $1 billion.
1999 in the West Pacific, the final year to use English names, and it's Typhoon Bart, which formed in the central part of the Western Pacific and tracked towards the north. A rather erratic track actually, intensifying to a Category 5 very close to the Japanese islands of Okinawa, and then passed to the northeast, making its first and second landfall on Kyushu and Honshu in Japan as a Cat 3. Its peak wind speed just before its closest approach to Okinawa was 160 miles an hour with a pressure of 930 millibars, so a rather strong storm. 2 landfalls, as I said, the strongest one 115 miles an hour. $5 billion of damages at the time, 7.1 today, the most expensive storm we've seen so far in Hurricane Week, and 51 fatalities, 81,000 buildings damaged by the storm. An almost incomprehensible amount. And here's the satellite imagery of how it progressed. Later, and this time it was the Florida Keys receiving its big storm, the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. The year 1935, whilst uneventful in the North Atlantic, did feature a few intense storms, and indeed 8 cyclones formed in total that year, with Florida and the Caribbean caught in the crosshairs. Though no one would have said that before August the 29th, and that was the date when what became known as the Labor Day hurricane formed, and indeed pummeled the Florida Keys and then moved on to the rest of the state. And we're pretty much standing at the landfall point of the storm here on Frege Key on September the 2nd as a ferocious Category 5 storm with one of the most intense air pressures of any Atlantic storm ever to make landfall in the United States. Jack Bevan from the National Hurricane Center explains more.
It is actually the 3rd strongest hurricane of record in the Atlantic Basin, as best as we can determine. Central pressure went down to 892 millibars, had a very small eye, and killed 400 people down in the middle Florida Keys, when it took a lot of people by surprise with how strong it was.
Damages totaled $6 million, and the Keys' railway link was destroyed and never rebuilt. Interesting to note that there weren't many images available from this storm either. The only ones I could find was of this train wreck that occurred as a result of the hurricane, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. I think it caused quite a few fatalities alone, this railway derailment. And here you can see some images of just what it looked like. That's the Labor Day hurricane. Landfall with an air pressure of 892 millibars, by the way. I'm not sure if that was mentioned earlier. A remarkable storm. Number 54 on Hurricane Week 2015. (1979) in the West Pacific, and who'd have thunk that it would be the most interesting year ever if you're interested in how intense a storm can get. And Typhoon Tip arrived and became a typhoon very close to Guam actually, and progressed towards the west-northwest, becoming a Category 5 for around a day or two, I think it was, and reached its peak intensity with winds of 190 miles an hour and an air pressure 870 millibars. Never been beaten since, though it almost has. And then after that it progressed towards the north, grazing some of the Japanese Ryukyu Islands, and then eventually making landfall on the mainland as a Category 1 typhoon. Not many people remember that bit. So as I said, peak intensity 190 miles an hour, remarkable 870 millibars, hasn't been beaten. Storms of the 70s came rather close. One storm in 2015 came rather close as well. 2 landfalls, 75 miles an hour, its first one. It caused $10 million of damages today. That's $323 million, and 99 fatalities as a result of Tip. Plenty of images as well, some of which you may not have seen before, so enjoy these. March 2004, and Cyclone Gafilo forms in the southwest Indian Ocean, becoming a tropical storm and then gradually intensifying further on its slow approach to Madagascar, rapidly intensifying at one point from Cat 2 to Cat 4, then becoming a Cat 5, just missing out on a Cat 5 landfall and instead striking Madagascar as a strong Category 4, and a second landfall as a tropical storm in the southern half of the country on the west coast. So this is how it looked on satellite imagery, a very strong landfall, and you're about to see it now. So its peak wind speed was, pardon me, 160 miles an hour. Its minimum air pressure was 895 millibars, a very strong storm again. Still nothing compared to Tip, but sub 900 in the southern hemisphere is pretty rare. 2 landfalls, 150 miles an hour, the strongest one, $250 million of damages, 311 if that was today. 418 fatalities as well, a serious event in Madagascar. The final storm of the lower 50, Super Typhoon Joan. 1970 storm, followed swiftly by Kate, by the way, but this one became a Category 5 before making landfall in the Philippines, the central to northern part of the Philippines, crossing Luzon and still remaining a significant typhoon on the other side, re-strengthening briefly to a Cat 3 and then eventually making landfall on Hainan Island as a Category 1 typhoon, before moving on to mainland China as a tropical storm. Typhoon Joan kicked off the 70s decade with a bang, 175 miles an hour its peak wind speed, minimum air pressure of 901 millibars, didn't go down well in the Philippines, 3 landfalls in all. It did kill 768 people in all and caused 10,000 buildings to be damaged, with $74 million in monetary damage and $450 million adjusted for inflation. Number 50, it's Super Typhoon Wanda of 1956. Became a very strong storm in the open West Pacific on approach to the Japanese islands way back in 1956 before satellite imagery, and it tracked pretty much over the Ayama Islands as a Cat 5 and made landfall in China not far from Shanghai as a strong Category 4 storm. A big landfall there. Intensity totals then, of course it was a Category 5 storm as we just saw. Its peak wind speed was actually a remarkable 200 miles an hour. I bet you weren't expecting that. Its lowest air pressure was 910 millibars. Just the one landfall at 150 miles an hour. We don't know much else about this storm, apart from the fact that it did kill 5,700 people. I assume most of those were in China, as many strong storms that make landfall there do end up killing lots of people due to flooding. Next up is Super Typhoon Gordon, which formed in July 1989, way out at sea actually, passing just north of the northernmost Mariana Islands and sailing towards the west-southwest, becoming a tropical storm, and became more apparent as time went on that it would become a long-range threat to the Philippines, becoming Category 5 not far from its landfall in Luzon and maintaining that intensity right up until that landfall. And then being a significantly weaker typhoon in the South China Sea, weakening to a tropical storm just before landfall in China. So an interesting track on that one. Remarkable how it didn't curve north at any point. 160 miles an hour it was in the end, and its peak minimum central pressure was 915 millibars. 2 landfalls, the strongest one at Cat 5, 160 miles an hour, caused $381 million in damages, $727 million today. 306 fatalities too, and over 55,000 buildings damaged or destroyed from Gordon, puts it at number 49 on Hurricane Week 2015. Next up we have Super Typhoon Zeb, which formed in October 1998 in the midst of many other storms that formed around it, becoming a Category 5 storm and almost making landfall at its peak intensity, weakening just before that landfall and then grazing the coast of Taiwan and then moving on to Japan. It wanted pretty much everywhere, Zeb. It went on a big tour of Asia by the looks of things. Its peak wind speed was at 180 miles an hour, very strong on approach. The satellite imagery will look impressive, I'm sure. 900 millibars that peak minimum central pressure, 6 landfalls in the end, 180 miles an hour it was its strongest landfall, so it did reach the Philippines at that intensity and caused over $1 billion of damages if you put it in today's money. Over 100 people killed by the storm as well, and no real surprise when you saw the amount of landfalls that it made, many of them occurring in Japan. Number 47, yes, it's another Super Typhoon. It's Super Typhoon Bess, which formed way out in the open West Pacific and became a Category 1 typhoon east of the Mariana Islands, intensifying steadily. Something very interesting about Bess, this storm was retired twice, believe it or not. This storm was used after it was retired. I don't know how that happened, but yes, 2 retirements of this storm. Category 5 was the peak there, just southeast of the Japanese islands, the Ogasawara Islands, making a landfall in Japan near Kyoto, still as a Category 1 by the time it got there, and caused lots of problems in Japan, I believe. Though, first of all, its peak intensity was 160 miles an hour, its pressure 900 millibars, so just about on the verge of going sub 900 there. Just a one landfall at 80 miles an hour, but look at those damage statistics. $5.68 billion of damages if you translate that to today's money, and over 17,000 buildings were destroyed, pretty much all of those, damaged or destroyed, pretty much all of those in Japan. Here's some imagery of the storm. And now we finally have an Indian Ocean storm. This one, Cyclone Gordon. I'm pretty sure many people are familiar with this one, but if you're not, you're about to be familiarized. Forming in June 2007, becoming a Category 5 in the Arabian Sea, and then weakening just east of the Arabian Peninsula, and just about making landfall as a tropical depression in Iran. The storm formed west of India. Here it is on the satellite imagery, and you can see its progression as it moved towards the northwest generally. There's its peak as a Cat 5, and then it just grazed the coast, no landfall there in Oman before moving towards the north. So, Cyclone Gonu, of course it was a Category 5, its peak wind speed 160 miles an hour in the air, sorry 165 even, stronger than I thought, 920 millibars in the end for Cyclone Gonu as well. No landfalls as a tropical storm, it was a TD when it made landfall in Iran, but look at the, again, those damage totals, $4.4 billion of damages at the time. Most of the problems occurring in Oman and neighbouring areas due to heavy rainfall, which obviously they're not used to over there in those very dry places along the Arabian Peninsula. Here's some images of Gonu, satellite and damaged pictures in the top right of your screen. Well, on to number 45, and it's Super Typhoon Flo, which formed in September 1990, way out in the West Pacific, and didn't become a tropical storm until clearing the Mariana Islands, and then strengthening rather rapidly, eventually to becoming a Category 5 just offshore the Japanese Ryukyu Islands, and finally making landfall in Japan as a Category 2. Woo! This storm peaked as a Category 5, as you saw, just east of those Ryukyu Islands, not far from Okinawa, 165 miles an hour, that peak wind speed, but look at the pressure, 890 millibars in the end. Just the one landfall at a Category 2 strength, 100 miles an hour. $4 billion of damages occurring from flow, mainly due to flooding and landslides in Japan. 50 fatalities, damage for buildings. The actual total of those is unknown. Here's some satellite images of flow. One of the worst storms of 1990 in the Westpac makes it to number 45 on Hurricane Week 2015.
Hurricane Allen, at the time of its occurrence, was known as the earliest Category 5 hurricane in the history of the Atlantic Basin, occurring in the first couple of days in August, which is quite remarkable. Only one storm has beat it, and that was Hurricane Emily. This storm is also known as the only Atlantic storm to have produced 190 mile-per-hour sustained winds. And for a little bit, it was also known as the only storm to have a reliably recorded air pressure underneath 900 millibars. This storm, at the time of its occurrence, set records of lowest air pressure in the Eastern Caribbean, Western Caribbean, as well as Western Gulf of Mexico, all of them underneath 910 millibars. This storm avoided all landfalls in the Caribbean and made its only landfall in Texas after it weakened drastically to a Category 3 hurricane and breaking the 1980 heat wave.
Despite that, it still broke the billion-dollar barrier, causing $1.2 billion of damages. Adjusted for inflation, that's over 3 in today's money, and it caused 269 fatalities along its treacherous route. Here's some imagery of Hurricane Allen, number 44 from 1980 in the Atlantic. And this here is the closest we'll get to a satellite imagery time-lapse of the storm. There's its progression towards the west-northwest. There weren't that many satellite images back then, at least not that you can find online anyway. Now to Mexico, and the west coast is about to get hit by a significant cyclone. October 1959. The time of year, does it remind you of something perhaps? This storm made landfall as a massive Category 5 storm in western Mexico at the end of October of that year. It's one of very few storms to have done that. Very few indeed. 160 miles an hour was its peak wind speed. Its minimum central pressure was only 958 millibars, one of the highest we've got on the top 100. Just the one landfall, but it was a big one, 160 miles an hour, as you can see reflected from the damage and fatality totals. It didn't go down well in Mexico either. 1,800 people lost their lives and over $280 million of damages from this storm. Well, we're back in the West Pacific again, and it's Super Typhoon Herb in July 1996 that we're looking at this time. This storm passed just to the north of the northernmost Mariana Islands as a tropical storm, intensifying along the way as it moved towards the west, slithered south a little bit, and became a Category 5 hurricane on approach to the Japanese Ryukyu Islands, in particular Yaeyama and Miyako Islands, which it passed pretty much right over as a Cat 5, and then hit Taiwan as a Cat 4 before striking China still as a typhoon as well. Pretty bad storm, particularly in those latter locations. Its peak wind speed, first of all, though, was Category 5, of course, 160 miles an hour, pressure 925 millibars in the end. But of course, its damage is worse than anything. $5 billion of damages at the time, is quite a lot, 7.5 in today's money. 590 fatalities in total as well from this massive storm that affected that whole region. And I presume it was over 19 buildings damaged, but that's the only ones we could confirm. Here are the images of Super Typhoon Herb. Some of these you may not have seen before. Not the best of quality, but it was 1996. Typhoon Herb, number 42 on Hurricane Week 2015. The final storm of this part, it was Typhoon Betty of 1987. Here it is, moving through the Philippines. Looked like a Cat 5 landfall there, certainly a strong one, and another strong landfall in Vietnam there as well. This storm did peak as a Category 5 just before its landfall in the Philippines, with winds of 160 miles an hour and a pressure right down to 890 millibars. What a strong landfall that would have been. 4 landfalls. It didn't reach peak intensity at landfall, though. It was 150 miles an hour, the strongest one. $100 million of damages, that's $207 million today, but over 92,000 buildings damaged in total, mainly in the Philippines and Vietnam. Bad storm.